Have you ever been playing one of the big FromSoft Souls games and thought to yourself, you know, this game's really awesome. I love this game, but it would just be so much better if I could play as a crab? No, I haven't thought that either, actually. That's a stupid thing to think. But such a game does exist, actually. It's called, what's it called? It's called Dark Souls. No, actually, it's called Floodborne. Sheldon Ring. Boo. It's called Another Crab's Treasure, and as it turns out, this crab Souls-like game is, like, really, really good. Another Crab's Treasure is developed by a team called Aggro Crab Games. These people just love crabs, apparently, and it's a Souls game that manages to do the unthinkable, something that no other Souls-like game could possibly dream of doing. It's a Souls-like game that doesn't feel anything like the Dark Souls games at all. Most developers that try to make a Souls game are often making games that are super derivative from FromSoft's Dark Souls or Elden Ring or Bloodborne. And that doesn't necessarily make them bad games. There are a lot of good Souls-likes out there that aren't made by FromSoft, but it does mean that all of these games sort of start to blend together a little bit. It all starts to feel very samey. But Another Crab's Treasure doesn't feel anything like any other Souls game on the market. It's part Souls-like, part platformer, and it has this super cutesy art style, and the way you make a build is completely different than in any other Souls game. It's clearly tried quite hard to differentiate itself from the other games in the genre, and that makes it feel like a breath of fresh air. The platforming is a centerpiece of the game, and although it can feel a bit janky at times, most of the platforming sections are pretty fun. The platforming is simple, but there's some neat little nuances to the platforming that make it feel fresh, like how most of your shelves roll if you get inside them whilst sprinting. I even found a crazy speedrun strat on my second playthrough by using the speed of the hill rolling mechanic to like fly across a gap. And the cherry on top is that there's a grappling hook too, and as we all know, a game having a grappling hook instantly gives it like +2 points on the game's IGN score. In this game, you play as Krill, a little hermit crab who had his shell stolen because he didn't pay his plastic taxes. So you venture out into the world to go get your shell back, and along the way you find out that pollution is making other crabs go crazy and start attacking people. And the world you find yourself in is so creative, it's just oozing with flavor. The cities are made from garbage, and the castles are made from polystyrene. The characters' clothes are also made from garbage, as are the shells that your character wears. The souls that you use to level up are called microplastics. There's a box of fries, but the packaging is like really suspicious. Krill's idle animation has him juggling his little health flask around, and when you interrupt the idle animation, he like drops it on the floor and you have to go pick it up. There's so many cool little details in the game. So much thought has gone into every tiny nook and cranny in the entire game, and this thoughtfulness can be felt throughout the entire experience. I even found a secret bonfire made of plastic up on a ridge somewhere that gave me a cosmetic that let me dress up as a Dark Soul. I'm literally Dark Souls. Look at me out, it's incredible. This game also does the really awesome thing that I love when games do, where it lets you sequence break if you're feeling like enough of a gamer. There's this area called the Sands Between, which is a really funny joke, by the way, 10 out of 10 game. It's this super wide open area with a bunch of different regions to explore. The characters tell you to go north to find a map piece or whatever, and this is the intended route through the game. It's where you're meant to go next. But you can also just ignore that and go to the east, and one of the later game areas is just sat there for you to go wander around in. You'll be under-leveled, but if you're feeling up to the challenge, there's nothing stopping you whatsoever from completely breaking the order of the game and just going there anyway. And there's also this giant crab boss in the middle of the Sands Between, a boss that you're clearly not supposed to fight yet. In fact, the game literally tells you that you're supposed to outrun the boss to get to your next location. But if you're feeling like enough of a gamer, there's nothing stopping you from just going and fighting the boss, which is of course exactly what I did in my first playthrough. If a game gives you the option to diff a boss and you don't sit there and smash your head into the wall until you win, are you even really like playing a video game at that point? It's a moment that reminds me a lot of Dark Souls 3, where in High Wall of Lothric there's this huge boss room with an NPC sitting in it, and if you kill the NPC, you summon the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. This boss is intended to be fought much later in the game, so when you do summon it early, it will be insanely tanky and one-shot you with every attack. But if you're feeling particularly saucy that day, the option to fight it is still still there. Now, this boss here isn't nearly as over-leveled as the Dancer is at the start of Dark Souls 3, so fighting this big-ass crab early is a bit easier than fighting the Dancer early. But it's still very cool that this sort of design decision gets made in a game like this. It makes a linear story game feel a whole lot less linear. Now, the art style of Another Crab's Treasure is brilliant. I love the way this game looks, and it's especially cool considering every other game in the genre is super dark and gritty looking. But there is a little bit of a downside to a Souls-like having an art style like this. Its cutesy art style and platforming mechanics has probably attracted a lot of unwitting players who don't even know what a Souls-like is. They bought it because they thought it was a neat looking platformer with a cute little crab guy as the main character, and they're gonna be in for a big surprise when the tree sentinel lobster crushes their skull in the starting area 3 minutes into their first playthrough. But if someone like that does come along, Another Crab's Treasure has them covered, because this game has a bunch of assist mode options for people who are struggling with the game. You can reduce enemy health and increase your dodge iframes and make the parry window bigger, and you can even just give Krill a gun, which is really funny. Now, this is probably quite controversial to your average Souls fan. The conversation of whether FromSoft's games should have an easy mode has been at the forefront of dumb garbage internet discourse for as long as Dark Souls has been a franchise. And me, being the, fence sitter that I am, I think both approaches to difficulty work great. It just depends on what type of game you're trying to make. I think that FromSoft not adding an easy mode is a good choice for their games, because there's a shared experience that comes from every player all having the same game with the same difficulty all the time. And the devs have a vision for how their game should be and how it should feel, and that vision should be respected. And if that artistic vision alienates some people who aren't into difficult games, then so be it. You wouldn't ask Stanley Kubrick to dumb down The Shining just to make it more palatable to a wider audience, and so too you shouldn't ask Miyazaki to make his game easier to appeal to a wider audience either. But on the other hand, I also think that having assist mode options is fine too, assuming it's the right game for it. I have sunk hundreds upon hundreds of hours into the FromSoft Souls games. Elden Ring in particular, I have a large amount of playtime in. I've seen everything there is to see, I've hitless the entire game. If Elden Ring had an easy mode, I wouldn't even use it. So when I personally play Another Crab's Treasure, I don't need to touch these assist modes whatsoever, and I do just fine. But if you're not into Souls games, but you still want to experience the story and see the world that the devs have created, then you can turn all these assist mode options up to 1 billion, and that works good for you. What other people choose to do with their game settings in a single player game doesn't affect me whatsoever. These are two very different approaches to difficulty, and both of them clearly cater to different types of audiences, but both of them work for the styles of games they're making, and each game is actually better off because of their decisions to add or not to add assist mode options into the game. And personally, I actually found this game to be the easiest Souls game I've ever played. And that's not necessarily a criticism. I actually think this game is incredibly good and would recommend you go play it. But I just didn't find myself struggling too much in many places. Although I have a funny feeling that the build I was using had a lot to do with how easy of a time I had with the game. But before I show you my Jesus build, let's quickly talk about how Another Crab's Treasure handles build variety. In most Souls games, your build will come from a few places, like the weapon you choose, or the weapon art attached to it, the stats you level up, the rings or talismans you use, the spells you use, all that good stuff. But in Elden Ring, some of these aspects are missing completely. There are no unlockable weapons whatsoever in the game. The only weapon you have to choose from is the one you start with, and that's it. There's also only 4 stats to level up. But with all these things missing, there's also new things to add that build variety back in, like this skill tree that lets you unlock a bunch of special abilities, like an air dodge or a parry, or the ability to stick stuff to your fork and make a hammer, which changes the moveset of your weapon entirely. There's also the shells you find. Krill is a hermit crab, and you can find a bunch of junk laying around the world that Krill can use as a shell, and each shell has a different shell spell that you can use to fight enemies, like a party hat that shoots confetti like a gun, or an empty can that shoots out bubbles. There's a massive number of available shells to choose from, bomb, all of which do a ton of different things. And then there's these special abilities. Certain major bosses will drop special abilities after they die that you can use in combat. You can also use these special abilities to find secrets too, like these big cubes that you can break to unlock new areas, which gives you a really interesting reason to backtrack through areas that you've already been to. So what the game loses from not having alternate weapons and stuff, it gains in other places. And there is also a talisman system called stowaways that works just like you'd expect it to. And in my first playthrough, I found a setup that allowed me to do ungodly amounts of damage to bosses. I had 4 ways to buff my damage. I had 2 stowaways, one that buffed my charged attacks by 40% and one that buffed my hammer damage by 30%. Then I unlocked this ability in the skill tree, so that after I block an enemy attack, my next attack deals bonus damage. Then I have the little red cup shell. This shell has a spell called Drunken Claw, which buffs the damage of my attacks by a huge amount, but it makes my dodge rolls worse and it makes me take more damage. So if I used my shell spell, then block a hit, then charge attack the boss with a hammer moveset, they like die. It's like a really big number I just dealt to that guy. So that might have had something to do with me finding the game a little bit easy. I was 3-shotting most of the bosses in the game, but the bosses had cool movesets. You could see that tons of thought had gone into it, and some of the later game bosses put up a whole lot more of a fight, with much larger health pools that were a lot less simple to just crush under the weight of my big fuck-off hammer. There was also the fact that most bosses were only one phase. There are only a handful of bosses in the entire game with a second phase to them, which definitely makes the fights feel much easier than in other Souls games, especially compared to a game like Lies of P, where literally every boss has a second phase, and there are so many 2-phase bosses that it actually feels draining after a while. But this game is the opposite. There's like 3 bosses in the entire game that have 2 phases, and I kind of found myself wishing the fights went on longer, because some of the boss designs were super cool and interesting, but they just didn't last long enough for me to truly appreciate it. My favorite boss was probably the second to last boss in the game. So spoiler alert if you don't want to see that boss, because I'm going to show it in 3, 2, 1, jellyfish. I thought this boss was great. Phase 1 was quite simple. The boss hovers in the sky and summons some crabs to fight you, and then when you kill all the crabs, the boss comes down and you get to hit the boss. But phase 2 is where it gets super interesting. Phase 2 is just a giant bullet hell with projectiles and bombs and spikes and stuff flying all around the screen. But the boss's health bar is just slowly draining the entire second phase, so all you have to do to win is survive. This is a really cool idea. Suddenly you're not trying to kill the boss, you're playing to survive the boss. But there was one boss in the game that I didn't really like at all, and that would be, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, this boss. It's an interesting idea where the boss has a bunch of different weapons it attacks you with, and when you deal enough damage to the boss, it will move across the arena to a different side, and depending where the boss is, the moveset will change based on the random item it's holding. But the problem with this boss that I had is that you can detach the weapon it's holding with your grapple hook, but this grappling hook has a finite number of uses. So when you had grappling hooks available, the boss felt very easy, but the moment you ran out of hooks, suddenly it felt impossible, which meant that this boss had massive difficulty spikes that felt like RNG. Some of its weapons were super easy to dodge, and some were super hard, and it's random which one it decides to use after it takes damage, and disarming the boss is only something you can do a finite number of times. In theory this works fine because you can just choose whether you should or should not disarm the boss, but it does mean that you can sort of just lose to RNG, which I didn't like very much. If the boss gets the harder to deal with weapons multiple times in a row, you will eventually just run out of hooks and be in trouble. But honestly, the majority of the bosses were super fun, and the platforming parts are mostly fun too. Now, Another Crab's Treasure is a fantastic game, and I really do recommend it, but the game is only a couple of weeks old. So as you can imagine, every now and then, there's a couple bugs. Bugs where you get stuck floating on some random geometry. Bugs where you roll over a random ledge and the game gets confused and makes you go space mode. Bugs where a boss shoots you in the face and makes you go space mode. The game had its fair share of bugs, but I can gladly say that since I started playing the game, a bunch of these bugs have been patched out. The devs are super active working on the game even after its release, which is really awesome to see, and is a lot more than most devs do after their games get released. So if you've ever wanted to play Dark Souls but you're like a crab for some reason, then the perfect game has just arrived on your doorstep. Thanks for watching.